Marguerite Ashworth, Countess of Aldermere, sank into her curtsy so precisely that no one in the long gallery could have called it anything but perfect, which was, of course, the point. She did not falter. She did not flush. She did not look for her son's eyes among the crowd, though she knew exactly where he stood, on the third stair from the landing, in his good blue coat, watching his mother bow to his father in front of 40 guests who had come to eat Aldermere's mutton and drink Aldermere's claret and witness, without quite admitting it to themselves, the quiet public demotion of the woman who had run the house for 9 years. Her thumb found the ring of keys at her waist, the still room key, the linen press key, the key to the dairy accounts, and pressed once, hard, against the smallest of them, the one that opened nothing she was permitted to use. Then her hand went still. Then she rose. By the time the frost came that year, the county would no longer speak of Julian Ashworth's wife as a woman who had been managed. They would speak of her as a woman no one had managed at all, and had been fools not to notice sooner. But that was still 11 weeks away, and on this particular July evening in the year 1814, Marguerite knew only that her husband had just called her, in front of witnesses suitable. The summer of 1814 had come to Ashdown the way summers there always came, heavy and slow and smelling of cut hay, indifferent to whatever was breaking quietly inside the houses it warmed. Aldermere Hall sat at the centre of 1,100 acres of arable land, chalk downland, a working quarry, and a mill on the fen water that had turned grain to flour for 6 generations of Ashworths, and for 2 of those years it had been Marguerite's to run in every particular except the one that mattered to the county. No one had asked her to. She had married Julian at 22, the daughter of a land agent whose chief inheritance to her had been a habit of mind rather than a fortune. Her father had kept books for 3 great estates before his death, and he had told her, more times than she could count, that a ledger does not lie, but it will keep quiet if you let it. She had not understood, at 16, what a strange thing that was to teach a daughter. She understood it now. Julian had been, at the time of their marriage, a serious young man recently made earl by his father's death, correct in his manners and careful in his affections, the way a man is careful who has learned that affection is a debt he cannot always pay. She had loved him with the patient, unspectacular love of someone building a house 1 brick at a time, certain that warmth accumulates. For 2 years she had kept the estate's true accounts in a hand no one examined, corrected the steward's arithmetic without ever being asked to, and learned the name of every tenant's second child. None of it had been visible, because it had been constant, and the county, like her husband, mistook constancy for absence. Then the old debt came home. Richard Ashworth, Julian's father, had once owed his life, or near enough to it, to a man named Winthrop, a corn factor, who had lent him £300 during a bad winter, and pulled him, quite literally, out of a flooded culvert the following spring. Winthrop had died 8 years past. His widow, Celia, had arrived at Aldermere that spring, with a black bonnet, a small son named Peter, and a claim on Julian's conscience that she wielded, Marguerite thought privately, the way other women wielded a fan expertly, and always where it would be seen. Julian had installed her in the dower cottage as a debt of honour. He had told Margaret this himself, plainly, without apparent guile, and Margaret had believed him, because at the time there had been nothing to disbelieve. It was only in June, when the quarterly accounts came to her for copying, and she noticed a payment to Mrs. Winthrop that did not match any figure her husband had ever mentioned aloud, that she began, quietly, to watch. She did not accuse. She did not ask. She opened a second ledger, in her own hand, and began to keep two sets of the truth, the one everyone was permitted to see, and the one that was simply accurate. By July, Celia Winthrop had stopped wearing black. The assembly that evening had been called, ostensibly, to mark the start of harvest preparations, a tradition as old as the house itself, in which the Countess curtsied to the Earl before the assembled tenantry and gentry as a sign that the household stood ready for the season's labour. It was a small, warm custom, meant to say we are one estate, one table, one purpose. Marguerite had performed it twice before, and both times Julian had bowed back, briefly, formally, and it had meant nothing more than good manners. This year he had raised his glass first. To the harvest, he had said, and then, because Celia Winthrop stood at his elbow in blue silk that had certainly not come from the Dower Cottage's allowance, he had added in the mild, reasonable voice of a man who believed himself perfectly fair, and to those who understand what this house requires of them. My wife has always been suitable. One does not require to love a ledger to keep it well. The room had laughed, gently, the way rooms laugh when they are relieved not to be the subject of the joke. Marguerite had curtsied. Edmund Ashworth was 9 years old, and he did not understand, in any way he could have named, why the room felt suddenly colder, or why his mother's hands, when she rose from her curtsy, were folded so carefully in front of her, as though she were holding something that might otherwise fall and break. He understood only that his father had said a true thing in a voice that made it sound like an insult, and that his mother had not cried, and that this, somehow, was worse than if she had. He did not go to her. He would think about that for years afterward, why he had not gone to her, why he had stood rooted on the third stair while his mother walked past the long windows and out onto the terrace alone, her spine straight as a rule laid against paper. She granted herself 7 minutes. She had learned to do this at 19, watching her own mother weather her father's long illness, and she had never found reason to abandon the practice, a fixed span of time, counted against the still-room clock, in which grief was permitted to be exactly as large as it wished, and not 1 minute longer. 7 minutes for the death of a friendship she had mistaken, for 2 years, for a marriage. 7 minutes for the boy on the stair who had not come to her, though she did not blame him for that. 9-year-olds do not yet know what to do with their father's cruelties. Then she opened her eyes, dried nothing, because there had been nothing to dry, and began her inventory. She had her mother's garnet brooch, which was hers outright by settlement, and could not be touched. She had £80 a year in pin money her father's solicitor had ring-fenced before the wedding, with a foresight she was only now grateful for. She had 2 years of a second ledger, kept in her own hand, that no one else in the house knew existed. She had her son, whatever the stare had or had not meant. And she counted this last, deliberately, the way her father had taught her to total a column twice every acre of practical knowledge about this estate that her husband did not possess, and had never troubled to acquire. She had, in short, more than she had walked in with. She thought, standing on the terrace with the hay smell thick in the dark, all right, then we will do it the long way. She found Mrs. Prudence Dale in the still-room an hour later, straining gooseberries through muslin with the unhurried competence of a woman who had run this house's kitchens for 30 years and outlasted 2 earls' worth of foolishness. "He called you suitable, Mrs. Dale said, without looking up. She did not ask if Marguerite had heard correctly. She had been in the doorway. He did. In front of the Hartleys. In front of that woman. He did that too. Mrs. Dale set down her muslin. She was not a woman who wasted words on comfort when work was available instead. What do you mean to do about it, my lady? Marguerite looked at the ring of keys at her waist, the still room key, the linen key, none of them the keys that governed anything that mattered, and she felt, for the first time since the ballroom, something that was not grief at all. I mean to become impossible to call suitable, she said. It will take rather longer than an evening. I should like your help. Mrs. Dale, who had buried a husband and raised 4 sons on this estate, and had precisely no patience left in her life for foolish men, allowed herself something that was not quite a smile. You'll have had it 30 years already, my lady, she said. You only just now asked. The steward's ledgers, when Marguerite finally sat with them properly in August, told a story that made her set down her pen twice before she trusted her hand to be steady. Mr. Pruitt, who had managed Aldemira's accounts since before Julian's father died, was not a dishonest man, only a tired one, and tired men make the same small error in the same direction for years without noticing, the way water finds the lowest point in a field and stays there. For 3 years the day labourers on the home farm had been paid at the old rate 1 shilling and 4pence a day, while the rate on every comparable estate in the county had risen to 1 shilling and 6pence. It was not theft. It was neglect wearing theft's coat, and the effect on 40 families, over 3 years, came to very nearly £90 that should have gone into the pockets of men who cut Aldemir's hay and had not. She did not bring this to Julian. She brought it to Mr. Pruitt himself, on a wet Tuesday, with the ledger open between them and her own recalculations, written beside his, in a hand deliberately as plain and legible as his was not. I make it £87, 4 shillings, she said, across 41 tenancies. I should like your figures checked against mine before either of us says a word to anyone. Pruitt, who had expected braced for even some manner of scene, found instead a woman asking to be corrected if she were wrong. He checked her figures twice. She was not wrong. It will want explaining to his lordship, Pruitt said unhappily. It will want correcting first, said Marguerite. Explanations are for afterward. She paid it from the estate's own contingency fund, properly recorded, properly witnessed, and she rode out herself to the home farm on a Thursday morning to tell Josiah Fenn, who had worked Aldemir land for 11 years and buried a wife on its churchyard corner, that his family was owed 11 shillings in arrears and would have it by Saturday. Fenn was a broad, slow-spoken man who did not trust gentry as a matter of policy, and he looked at her a long moment before he answered. "Beg pardon, my lady, but his lordship send you?" "No," she said. "I found the error. I am correcting it. His lordship will hear of it when I have finished, not before." Fenn turned his hat once in his hands. "That's an odd way to run an estate." "It is the only honest way to run one," Marguerite said. "The other way is simply the usual way." He did not smile. Josiah Fenn was not a man given to smiling at gentry, but he nodded, once, the way a man nods when a scale has been tipped back level, and by Michaelmas every tenant on the home farm knew that the Countess herself had found the shortfall, and paid it before anyone had thought to ask. Julian noticed her, for the first time in longer than either of them would have admitted, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, when Pruitt mentioned in passing, over the account books, that her ladyship had settled a wage discrepancy some weeks past. "Settled it how?" Julian asked. "Found it herself, my lord." Recalculated the whole home farm. paid it from contingency and had me witness the payments. Julian said nothing for a moment. Something behind his eyes moved. The particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, not the sums themselves, but what the sums implied about how long he had failed to look at them. That evening at dinner, he watched his wife discuss the quarry's autumn output with a precision he had never once required of her, and when she made a dry observation about the quarry foreman's habit of rounding every figure conveniently upward, something moved at the corner of Julian's mouth that was not quite a smile. It lasted, perhaps, 2 seconds. Marguerite did not miss it. She filed it away in the same private ledger where she kept everything else that might, one day, add up to something. It was the first rung of a ladder neither of them had yet agreed to climb. The quarry dispute came in November, and it was, on its surface, a small thing, a boundary disagreement with the neighbouring Calder estate over a stretch of stone-bearing ground both families had quietly disputed for 2 generations, resolved by nobody because it had never mattered enough to anyone to resolve. It mattered now, because Celia Winthrop's late husband had once held a lease on precisely that ground, and Celia had begun, delicately, to suggest to Julian that the boundary ought to be redrawn in a manner that happened, entirely by coincidence, to restore a portion of that old lease's value to her. Marguerite went to the parish records herself. She went to the county surveyor's office in Fenbridge and paid 4 shillings to have the original 18th-century survey copied in full. She went, finally, to Mr. Whitlock, the family's solicitor, a precise and procedural man who had served 2 earls and trusted paper over sentiment in every instance Marguerite had observed. The 1761 survey places the boundary at the old sheep-wash, she told him, spreading both documents on his desk. Not the streamed. Mrs. Winthrop's claim depends entirely on the streamed being the boundary. It never was. Whitlock studied the documents for a long moment. Mrs. Winthrop believes otherwise, my lady, and with respect, she has been rather persuasive with his lordship on the point. I am not asking you to disbelieve Mrs. Winthrop, Marguerite said. I am asking you to read a map. Whitlock read the map. Whitlock, who prided himself on being unmoved by persuasion of any kind that was not written in a clerk's careful hand, found himself moved anyway, and said so to Julian within the week, in terms that left Julian visibly unsettled for reasons that had less to do with Stone than with his own wife. It was that same month, in the amber light of an early dusk, that Julian told her not as confession, not yet as anything so whole as that, but as explanation offered sideways, the way men offer the things they are not yet ready to call true about his mother. She died when I was 7, he said. They were in the estate office, the ledgers between them like a third party neither had invited, but both had grown used to. My father never spoke of her after. He told me once that a man who lets himself be attached to a thing that can be taken from him has made himself a fool twice, once in the losing, and once in having let himself love it enough to lose it. Marguerite did not reach for him. She had learned by then that Julian flinched from comfort offered too quickly, the way a burned hand flinches from a kettle, even after it has cooled. And Mrs. Winthrop's husband, she said instead carefully, the debt. My father would have drowned in that culvert without him. He asked me, before he died, to see the family did not want. I have been trying to pay a dead man's debt with my living wife's dignity, and I did not see it that way until you said it just now. I did not say it. You did not need to, Julian said. You only had to be right about the streamed. He did not apologize that night. It was not yet time for a full apology, and both of them, in their different ways, understood this. But he asked her, before she left the office, a question he had not asked in 9 years of marriage. What would you do if the estate were only yours to manage? No father's ghost. No debt. What would you do with it? Marguerite considered this with the same care she gave any real question. I would pay fairly and post the wage publicly, so no one need find the error by accident again, she said. I would not lie to tenants about what they are owed. And I would not curtsy to a man in front of a room unless I believed, that day, that he had earned it. Julian was quiet for a moment. I have not earned it in some time. No, Marguerite agreed. You have not. I should like to. Then earn it, she said. Not tonight, not with words. Show me over time. That was, as near as either of them could later locate it, the beginning of the thaw, not an apology, not a reconciliation, but a plain admission that the ledger between them was overdue, and that overdue debts, unlike affection, could at least be itemized. He gave her the key to the document room the following week. It was an odd, almost embarrassed gesture, his father's old private room, where estate deeds, correspondence, and 40 years of family paper had been kept locked since before Julian's birth. Opened to her not with ceremony, but with a single key laid on the desk between them. The way a man lays down a card he is not certain is a winning one. My father kept it closed to everyone, Julian said, including me, for years. I do not entirely know what is in it. I should like you to know, since you seem better able than either of us to know what a room like that is worth. Marguerite closed her hand over the key. It was heavier than the still-room key, heavier than the linen key, heavier, it seemed to her, than any object she had held since her wedding ring. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her. She found the letter on a Tuesday in February, in a dispatch box near the bottom of the third shelf, tucked behind a folder of quarry leases that had not been disturbed by the dust on them in a decade. It purported to be from Richard Ashworth, dated 1810, granting Mrs. Celia Winthrop, in perpetual gratitude for her late husband's service to the family, an annuity of £40 a year from the quarry's income to continue for her lifetime and her son's. Marguerite read it twice. Then she did what her father had taught her to do with any figure that felt too convenient. She checked it against everything else. The paper was wrong first. Aldermere's letters from 1810 were written on stock from a mill in Fembridge, with a distinctive laid pattern. This sheet's watermark belonged to a paper mill that, she confirmed within a fortnight by writing to the mill's owner directly, had not begun producing that particular stock until 1812. The hand was close enough to have fooled anyone who had not, as Marguerite had, spent 2 years copying the old Earl's correspondence into fair copies for the estate's files, and learned the particular slope of his capital letters, the way he crossed his sevens. This hand crossed its sevens differently. And the debt itself, when she finally located the original loan document in a folder marked, unhelpfully, sundry, showed a receipt dated 1803, witnessed by the Fembridge Bank's manager, and signed by Winthrop's own hand acknowledging repayment of the full £300, with interest, 11 years before this letter claimed a debt still owed. The debt of honour Julian had spent 2 years and hundreds of pounds discharging had already been paid, in full, before either of them was born to the marriage. She sat a long while with that knowledge before she moved. She did not go to Julian first. She went to the old clerk, a Mr. Simmons, who had served Richard Ashworth for 30 years and now lived in a cottage near the mill on a small pension, and who remembered, when she asked him plainly, that the old Earl had indeed cleared the Winthrop debt himself in 1803, and had said so at the time, with some relief, because he had never liked owing any man anything he could not immediately repay. "Would you swear to that, Mr. Simmons, before a magistrate if it came to it?" Simmons, who was old and slow but not a man who enjoyed being made a fool of by forged paper, said that he would be glad to. Celia Winthrop, for her part, did not wait quietly to be found out. She had watched Marguerite's steady climb through the autumn and winter with the particular alertness of a woman who knows, before anyone tells her, that the ground beneath her has begun to move, and in March she moved first. The letter arrived at the rectory, addressed to the vicar's wife, and was at the breakfast table of half the county within 3 days, an unsigned account, purporting to come from a servant's testimony, suggesting that the Countess had been seen in close and improper conversation with a former suitor during a visit to Fenbridge the previous autumn, the same visit, in fact, on which Marguerite had gone to copy the old survey. It was, Marguerite understood at once, both petty and precise, aimed exactly at the one currency a woman's reputation still traded in, timed exactly to arrive before Marguerite could bring her own evidence forward, calculated to make Julian doubt her at the very moment doubt would cost the most. She did not deny it in company. She did not weep. She wrote, instead, a short letter to the surveyor's clerk in Fenbridge, asking him to confirm, in writing, the date and purpose of her visit, and the presence throughout of his own wife as chaperone. And she set that confirmation beside the forged annuity letter in a single folder, and she waited. She meant to frighten you into silence before the harvest assembly, Mrs. Dale said, when Marguerite told her. She very nearly succeeded in frightening someone, Marguerite agreed. It was not me. The harvest assembly that September was, by long custom, the one occasion each year on which every tenant, every neighbouring family, and the county's own magistrate gathered at Aldermere, under one roof to settle accounts, hear grievances, and mark the turn of the season, and it was into this gathering, with Sir Robert Ives presiding in his capacity as magistrate for matters of dispute, that Marguerite chose to bring her folder. She did not ask permission. She asked only that Julian stand beside her, and he did. "I have a matter to lay before the parish," she said, when the hall had quieted, "concerning the annuity long paid from this estate's quarry income to Mrs. Winthrop." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room had gone very still. The particular stillness of a crowd that senses, before it understands, that something real is about to happen. "I have here a letter dated 1810, purporting to be from the late Earl, granting that annuity. I have also here a receipt, dated 1803, and witnessed by the Fenbridge Bank, showing the debt it claims to honour was repaid 7 years before this letter's date. I have the sworn word of Mr. Simmons, who served the late Earl for 30 years, that he handled that repayment himself, and I have a letter from the paper mill at Cressley, confirming that the stock this annuity letter is written on was not milled until 1812, 2 years after its stated date. She laid each document on the long table as she named it, and the room watched them accumulate the way a jury watches evidence stack, one card at a time, into a verdict. I do not say this to shame anyone before their neighbours, she went on, and here, for the first time, something in her voice cost her a little to keep level. I say it because a false debt has drawn £40 a year from this estate's quarry money that should by rights have gone toward fair wages for the men who work that quarry for 6 years. On the strength of a letter my husband's father never wrote. Josiah Fenn stood, unbidden, at the back of the hall. "Beg pardon, Sir Robert," he said, turning his hat once in his hands the way he always did. "Her ladyship come to me herself last autumn, and paid what was owed on the home farm out of her own reckoning. before ever she had cause to prove herself to anyone here. I'll swear to that, if it's wanted. It was not strictly evidence that touched the forgery at all, but the room heard it as exactly what it was: a working man standing up, unasked, to say he had already seen this woman's honesty tested and found it sound, and something in the assembly's collective posture shifted, the way a field of standing grain shifts all at once when the wind finally changes direction. Celia Winthrop, who had come prepared to be affronted, found she had nothing prepared for this. Something behind her composure, which had been smooth as poured cream for 2 years, went out all at once, like a candle in a door's sudden draught. "I did not forge that letter," she said, too quickly, into a room that had not yet accused her of forging it. "I have not said who wrote it," Marguerite said quietly. Only that the old Earl did not. Sir Robert Ives examined the documents himself, slowly, the procedural silence of a careful man given weight by the whole room's waiting. "The paper mill's letter alone would want answering," he said at last, "and the repayment receipt wants answering a good deal more. Mrs. Winthrop, I think you had better account for how a letter written on 1812 paper came to bear a date of 1810. Celia Winthrop could not account for it. She had, in fact, written it herself, in a careful imitation of a dead man's hand, in the desperate arithmetic of a widow who had once loved the wrong Ashworth and had spent 2 years trying to buy, with paper, what she had never been offered honestly. Marguerite could have ruined her entirely. The forgery alone would have answered to the law. And the law in that county was not gentle with forged testamentary paper. She did not choose that. "I do not ask for prosecution," she said, into the room's held breath. "I ask that the annuity cease, that the sums improperly drawn be repaid to the estate at a rate Mrs. Winthrop and I can agree upon between us, and that she and her son remove to a situation of their own choosing, at a distance, with a small honest allowance from my own dower funds, not the estate's, to see the boy educated properly. He did not choose his mother's paper. It cost her. Everyone in that hall understood. Something real to offer mercy from a position that could instead have destroyed. That was precisely why the room believed it. Julian, standing beside her, said nothing for a long moment. Then, in front of the same assembly that had once heard him call his wife suitable, he said, quietly enough that only those nearest heard it at all, "She was never suitable. She was essential to everything this house is, and I did not see it until she built the proof of it herself, without my help." Edmund, 12 now, watching from the same stair he had stood on 3 years before, saw his father's shoulders come down an inch. The way a roof settles once a wall beneath it has finally been made sound. The full accounting came that night, in the estate office, with the door shut, and no ledger between them at all. I let her stay because I was afraid of what it meant to owe someone honestly, and pay it in full, Julian said. "My father taught me that attachment is a debt that always comes due at the worst possible moment, and I built my whole life around never owing anyone that much. I owed you that much for years, and I paid you in the coin I understood, which was management, not love, because love felt like the one ledger I could never balance." "That is an explanation," Marguerite said. "It is not yet an apology." "I am sorry," Julian said, and for once there was nothing careful in it. "Not sorry that it happened to be inconvenient, sorry that I called you a word that meant nothing, in front of people, because I was too much a coward to call you what you were." "All right," Marguerite said. "All right," Julian repeated then. "Then I have terms," she said, and she had, in fact, written them down, because she had learned that verbal agreements in that house tended to evaporate by breakfast. The estate ledgers are kept jointly, in my hand as often as Pruitt's, permanently, not as a favour to me. Wages are posted publicly each quarter, so no error goes 3 years uncorrected again. I will not manage your grief for you, I will stand beside you while you do it yourself. And I will not curtsy to you at another harvest assembly unless, that year, I believe you have earned it. All right, Julian said again, and this time it sounded like a vow rather than an answer. Mr. Whitlock came the following week, hat in hand in a manner that did not suit a solicitor's usual dignity, to apologise for having believed Celia Winthrop's claim readily enough to press it on Julian at all. I ought to have questioned the paper before I questioned your ladyship's arithmetic, he admitted. You believed a dead man's signature over a living woman's sums, Marguerite said. It is a common enough error. See that you do not make it again. I shan't, Whitlock said. All right, then, said Marguerite, and something in the solicitor's stiff shoulders eased, the way shoulders ease when a debt has finally, plainly, been forgiven rather than merely forgotten. The proof came in ordinary days, the way proof always does once the speeches are finished. It was Julian moving his chair from behind the desk to beside hers in the document room, without remark, as though he had always sat there. It was Julian pouring her tea before she asked for it, getting the amount of sugar wrong twice before he got it right, and never once apologising for the getting it wrong, only for having taken so long to notice how she took it. It was Edmund, 13 that winter, asking at supper what a quarry lease was and receiving, for the first time in his life, a real answer from both his parents at once, passed back and forth between them like a shared task rather than a lecture. There was one relapse. In November, a tenant dispute over a broken fence line came to Julian directly, and from old habit the habit of 9 years, not undone in a season he settled it alone, over supper, without consulting the woman whose ledgers would record it. Marguerite named it plainly the next morning in the document room. You did that alone, out of the old way, not out of malice. I want you to notice that you did it, so it does not become the new way by accident. Julian was quiet for a moment. You are right, he said. I noticed it myself an hour after, and I did not like what I noticed. He reversed the arrangement with the tenant himself, in writing, jointly signed, and told her so before she had to ask. I would choose you, he said to her one evening in December, with no ledger between them and no assembly watching. I have been choosing you for some time now, only badly, and mostly alone. I should like to choose you properly, in company, for as long as either of us is given. It was not the bare, ordinary phrase the county's other husbands offered their wives over breakfast without thinking. It was, Marguerite understood, exactly the right words for a man who had spent his whole life afraid that loving a thing meant it would be taken from him, and had decided, finally, that the choosing was worth the risk regardless. All right, she said. All right then, said Julian, and it was at last the whole treaty. 2 years passed the way seasons pass on a working estate in wages posted, and hay brought in and small repairs made before they became large ones. The fair wage board Marguerite had instituted at the harvest assembly still hung. That second autumn, in the home farm's threshing barn, updated each quarter in a clerk's plain hand. And Josiah Fenn's eldest boy had gone, that spring, to the small school Marguerite had founded in the old dower cottage, the same cottage Celia Winthrop had once occupied, where tenant children learned their letters and their sums from a schoolmistress paid, permanently, from the estate's own accounts, rather than anyone's charity. Celia Winthrop lived by then in a modest house 2 counties distant, on the small allowance Marguerite had promised, and continued to pay from her own dower funds without complaint or public remark. She wrote once a year, at Christmas, brief letters that had grown, over time, from resentful to merely sad, to, in the last, almost grateful. Her son Peter, apprenticed at 15 to a solicitor in Fembridge on Whitlock's own recommendation, wrote more often, and better, and had begun, Marguerite noted with some private satisfaction, to keep his own books with a care that owed nothing at all to his mother's example. Edmund was 15 now, tall enough to nearly meet his father's eye, and it was Edmund who stood on the gallery stair one September evening, at the harvest assembly 2 years on, and watched his mother rise from a curtsy she had chosen, that year, to give, because that year she had told her son plainly his father had earned it. What Edmund had not expected, what made him go very still on the stair, the way his mother once had in the ballroom below, was that his father bowed back, not the brief formal nod of 9 years' habit, but a full, deliberate bow, low enough that the whole room saw it, low enough that there could be no mistaking it for manners rather than meaning. "You are not what I bargained for," Julian had said to her once, in the earliest bitter days of that long winter, meaning it as something between an accusation and an excuse. "You are not what I bargained for," he said again that September evening, before the whole assembled county, and this time he finished it. "You are what I would beg for, if begging was still required, which because of the woman you are it no longer is." Marguerite's own father had told her once that a ledger does not lie, but it will keep quiet if you let it. She had stopped letting it, on a July evening 3 years before, and had not stopped since. She had asked, once, only to be seen. She had learned, in the years that followed, that being seen was not a thing anyone could grant her. It was a thing she had to build, column by column, correction by correction, mercy by deliberate mercy, until it stood on its own, and needed no one's permission to be believed. She had stopped asking to be loved for what she did quietly. She had made the quiet impossible to overlook, and the overlooking, once undone, could not be redone. Not because a room finally applauded her rooms are fickle, and applause is cheap, and she had never once built anything to earn it, but because she had kept the second ledger, the true one, long after anyone required her to, simply because the truth deserved to be kept somewhere, even if no one ever asked to read it. That, in the end, was the whole of what she had built, not a kingdom handed to her, and not a kingdom seized from anyone else, but one assembled quietly, correctly, and honestly, out of exactly the materials everyone else had overlooked, until the house that had once held its breath around her finally, unmistakably, began to breathe.